Okay, well, hello everyone. I'd love to introduce my interviewee for today, Dr. AnneMarie Dorland. And just to give you guys a brief interview, Dr. AnneMarie Dorland is an assistant professor in the Bissett School of Business at Mount Royal University, where she teaches marketing, brand strategy design, design literacy, and qualitative research, among other topics. Much of AnneMarie's research explores creativity and creative problem-solving practices, such as designed approaches to thinking in a variety of sectors. AnneMarie is further a contributor to several international publications on design thinking and creative research practice. Recently, she contributed to the Creative City Ecosystem Report, which was published just last year in June 2021. This report highlights the value of the creative economy, how it brings value to Calgary, not just in an economic sense, but also in a social, human, and environmental sense. And so the creative economy in Calgary is what we'll be discussing today. So welcome, AnneMarie, and thank you very much for joining me.
Thanks, Mark. It's nice to be here.
Perfect. So the first question I'd love to get from you is, so you've worked quite a bit in the creative economy, and I'd love to know, do you have a sort of motivation in working in the creative economy? Is there something that inspires you to work in the creative economy?
Well, the creative economy has always been my home, my people. I trained as a graphic designer in my undergraduate degree, which was really just a chance to do a bachelor's degree in the thing I'd been doing my whole life, which was words and images together to convey meaning. So when I found out that was an option at the post-secondary level, I was very excited. And then I worked in the artist-run center community in Edmonton for a long time at some really great gallery spaces, and then moved on to study how those people work. So it's always been in my blood. It's always been something I've been really passionate about. So, and researching with members of the creative economy, with cultural creators, and about the creative economy has really been an inspiring way to learn more about the community that means so much to me.
Okay, wonderful. So you've worked in the creative economy entirely in Alberta, or have you had the opportunity to work in different cities in Canada?
I've had the opportunity to work across Canada in that I was living and working in Montreal for a while,
Oh,
conducting
cool.
research in Toronto, and then I partner with quite a few people in kind of European creative economy spaces, specifically in Scandinavian countries, and then also in England. Um, so really getting a perspective from across Canada, but my primary area of focus right now is Alberta's creative spaces and the cultural creators that live and work here.
Okay, so in regards to Alberta's creative space, is there anything specifically that makes Alberta's creatives or creative economy or creative institutions specifically unique from the other areas that you've had the opportunity to work with?
Well, I don't know if I'd say this is missing from anywhere else, but maybe the thing that excites me the most about creative economy sectors in Alberta, creative institutions in Alberta, and the creatives that work there is really this sense of permeability, the way that people are able to move between sectors, the collaborations that happen partly because of our entrepreneurial spirit here in the Alberta space, partly because we're new to the game in many extents, and we don't have necessarily the long, deep roots of the cultural communities or cultural production communities in other bigger cities, which means that we're nimble and we get to build it ourselves. And that's just a really vibrant, exciting space to be in. Alberta's creative economy leads the way in many of the Canadian sectors, and seeing so many different people come to participate in it is maybe what's most exciting to me, especially about the Calgary space.
Okay, that's great to hear. And specifically in the Calgary space, you've mentioned that our creative economy is growing. What specifically about the creative space in Calgary would you say is growing? Is there a specific subcategory in the creative space that stands out, or would you say it's kind of just like the creative space as a whole that's growing?
I'd say it's probably two things, and I don't know if I can kind of rank them in terms of what's more important and what's not, but I would suggest that our creative industries, which is what we measure best because we measure economic function better than we measure sometimes social impact, but our creative industries are growing in a way that's just bananas. I mean, it's so amazing to watch. I mean, right now, our creative sectors, the last big reported number was that they created $3.1 billion in labor income per year for the province, which is wild and a completely it's an industry that lives in the shadows. It's not the one we talk about. It's not something we talk about as an economic driver. So when I talk about growing, that's one of the ways that it's growing. But I think another thing to look at is also the importance that other industries are placing on creative practice and on collaborating with people who are thinking creatively. So when we talk about cultural producers, sometimes we're talking about very typical jobs that make up that quadrant. So artists, actors, musicians, designers, architects, fashion designers, that kind of space. But then there's also a lot of people who work in really creative functions in oil and gas, or really creative functions in tech startup. There's UX designers working for someone who's launching the next Skip the Dishes, right? So this is a intersectional space that's also growing. So one of the things that I get really jazzed up about is seeing how important that's becoming to people who aren't just those of us on the inside, how important that's becoming to people on the outside too.
Those are great points, and I'm just kind of interested in trying to understand like what are the different drivers that have led to the creative economy seeing, especially in like you don't really perceive many people don't really perceive Alberta as a very creative province
Mm-hmm.
because our priorities lie elsewhere, but but we still see a huge boom in creativity, and like how you said, it's a lot of that cross industry in a cross industry sense. So I'm wondering, like, do you think that people are just valuing creativity more, or what do you think are the different drivers of the growth that we've been seeing?
Well, I mean, it's hard to say. It'll be different for every context. I think one of the things that we've realized is non negotiable, is imperative to our success as a province, is our ability to be creative. And that is not just in terms of creating a culture where people want to stay. And we know that the creative community is one of the leading drivers of why people live in a city. Calgary has just been ranked as one of the top three, I think maybe even number one most livable cities in North America. And a big driver of that is our creative spaces, our cultural sector. So people are starting to recognize that if we let that go, we lose our people and we don't bring new ones in. So that's maybe one driver. Another driver is that we're at a point in all of our industries that unless we learn to change, we will die. So, unless we have people thinking creatively in all sectors, we will not be able to innovate in the way we need to survive. So, that could be something as tangible as finding new ways for energy resource extraction to happen in a safe manner for the environment and for culture. Or it could be something as abstract as coming up with the next big thing that's homegrown on Alberta soil. So I think those two things are really big drivers as to why we're finally starting to focus some attention, maybe lend some support, do a little bit of nourishing of our creative economy in all four of the sectors that we talk about when we're talking about that space.
And uh, on the topic of the four sectors, we do have in the report highlighted a sort of four cluster or four sector model that
Mm-hmm.
I know you and Dr. David Finch had a hand in making to categorize the different creative disciplines. And so I just wanted to bring that up.
So what you're describing, I think, is what's called the Nesta model, which is actually a model out
Yes.
of the United Kingdom. And it's a model
Yeah.
that's used internationally in conjunction with another one where I can kind of describe it. But the Nesta model is a really nice way for us to imagine all of the members of the ecosystem that make up a wider creative economy. It's really easy for us to imagine that the creative economy is only driven by creative industries, right? People who make money being creative. But that's not true. And the Nesta model is a really beautiful way of understanding all of those participants. So you can see you have a creative industries quadrant. So that's things like design, architecture, photography, advertising, fashion. Those are income categories. Those are things you can report on a tax return as saying, I am one of these people. And right now, Alberta is home to 14% of all of Canada's advertising agencies, which is a really big deal. We've got 10% of all of our design enterprises, 8% of our marketing and marketing research firms, 12% of all Canadian photographers live in Alberta. So these are big numbers. We are really punching above our weight when it comes to those creative industries right now. And a lot of that has to do with our support of solopreneurs, entrepreneurs, people who want to start their own businesses here in Alberta. That goes a long way towards some of the growth of some of these sectors. You can also see that we have something called the creative industries. Sorry, let's see if I can get this right the way I say it out loud, out of my mouth. Cultural industries quadrant. And that's film and video, broadcasting, gaming, music, publishing, interactive media. So these are the industries that create culture. And right now, based on some of the information that we have from our film colleagues, Alberta is the filming home of more Oscar, Emmy, and Golden Globe award-winning film productions than any other Canadian province. So we're really, really nourishing that sector as well. We've got 3,000 people or more working in the film industries annually, which is so many Albertans. And right now, that's our music industry alone is 20,000 jobs for Albertans per year. 16.9 of our total GDP is generated by cultural industries. So those are big figures that show how big that is in the Alberta space as well. The next quadrant over is the cultural quadrant. So when we talk about the arts community, that's where these humans live in there. So that's visual arts, performing arts, heritage organizations, museums, libraries. Those all live in that cultural quadrant. So that brings in about $5.3 billion per year in our annual economy in the Alberta space. And I mean, it touches the lives of almost all Albertans. In a recent survey, they showed that 76% of Albertans had participated in an arts event or activity in the last year. So 76% of anybody is a lot, but especially to have participated in and touching directly into this sector, which is really important. And it's important to us as well. So when surveyed, 84.5% of Albertans felt that activities from this quadrant were vital to their lives, which really shows the highlight or the spotlight that we're putting on them. The last part of the NESTA model is, to be really honest, the trickiest and the weirdest, not only in its naming, but also to kind of understand, and that's the transversal industries. So that's that weird group of people that I was describing earlier who work in creative roles, but not always in creative industries. So that's things like cultural tourism, that's creative education, it's me, computer system design, things like that, where you're working creatively and you might have creative training, but you're not necessarily working in one of the easier boxes to place you in. So that's a big source of investment support, especially when we talk about the world of digital transformation, which is where a lot of these creative producers or cultural producers are working in digital transformation or DX. And right now the forecast is that is going to be an annual spend of about $18 billion per year on changing those business practices, driven almost entirely by the creative thinkers in that space. So it's a model that helps us understand who's contributing, who's growing, but it's also a model that helps us kind of tease out the differences between the cultural value and the economic value of each of those sectors.
That's great. Thank you so much for explaining this in detail. And just to circle back to NESTA, so that stands for, so NESTA is from the UK, the National Endowment for Science, Technology, and the Arts. And so this model was sort of informed by research already done by NESTA?
Yes.
And
so
created,
NESTA's built off a long history in the UK of supporting creativity as a major export power of the United Kingdom. So back in, I'm going to say the early 2000s, 2005-ish, a really famous report was put out by the UK government called the Cox Report, which determined that the future of the UK, which had been reliant on industry for the past 300 years, would in the future be entirely reliant on creativity and on finding ways to connect that to every industry that existed in their space. And so from that, organizations like NESTA took up the challenge and started mapping the actual effects of these industries and economic quadrants and seeing how they work together and what kind of ecosystem they created.
Okay, I see.
Yeah,
So if I'm an employee for a consulting agency that works within the creative industries,
sure.
based on this model, what circle would I fit into?
So if you're an employee or you're an employee within the creative industries, you're saying?
An employee for a consulting agency, but a consultant agency that works within creative industries.
Boy. Well, now we're getting personal, Mark, I think. 'Cause that's exactly what you are. Um,
Exactly.
but I don't know. It depends, right? Which is kind of, I know, a difficult answer. But assuming that I'm going to take the example of Bird Creative, and I'm going to call you consultants who support the music industry with your work with the CCMAs, who support the theater industry, who support the wider cultural production industry or the cultural community here in Calgary, but who also do a little tap dancing over in the economic development world. You could easily fall into any of these quadrants. I think more important is, what is the sectoral output? So, what are you creating? We're at all times talking about cultural creators, right? These are the people in our world who are creating our culture. And so if you are a consultant who is supporting that work, you're transversal, probably. That's like the easy peasy way to do it. But if what you output into the world is a film about creative producers or cultural creators, then maybe you get to slide over more into one of the other spaces. So, what we call people is less important than how we understand what's being created by this wider ecosystem, the output of the ecosystem itself, and its impact on the rest of the Alberta or Canadian or national ecosystem, too.
Good to know. So is there an importance of, for example, an individual or an organization knowing what circle they fall into? Or is this model, would you say, more beneficial for you know, policymakers, governments, and planning to inform future policy?
I would say that this is a really helpful model from a policymaker perspective, because it helps to right size the value and the contribution when you're comparing apples and oranges, to be honest. It can be really hard to look at the film industry versus, let's say, the cultural tourism and heritage industry and just hold them up one for one. They're different. They're just inherently different. There's different jobs involved. So this is a little bit of a map of the zoo. It's a little bit of a chance for us to see where everybody is and what they're doing and keep them kind of in an organized fashion, though, of course, there's bleeding. Another model we use a lot when we're talking about the creative economy that I think is really supportive is put forward by Cunningham and Higgs, who are two researchers who've been doing a lot of work on this. And it's called the creative trident model. And it can be really helpful when we're talking about people as opposed to economic sectors or economic drivers. So in the creative trident model, they talk about people who participate in the creative and cultural economy in one of three ways. Either they're talking about specialist individuals. So those are people who work in creative occupations that are employed in one of the creative economy quadrants. They talk about supporter individuals, and those are people who are working in the creative economy but not working in creative occupations. Because there's also like a lot of accountants who keep the galleries running and things like that, right? So those would be considered supporter individuals. So sales, management, secretarial, accounting, administration, all of those things, supporter. And then there's embedded individuals. And those are people who are working in a creative occupation, but outside of one of the quadrants. So when we layer these two models together, we get both an individual view and a sectoral or economic view of what we're looking at. And I think those two things, you need both lenses to see things appropriately.
Okay, great to know. And in creating this model specifically, how how are you hoping this model impacts uh, policy or decision makers?
Well, in using this model for the report that was launched in June of 21, I think our hope was that it would help those who were making decisions, especially economic support decisions, understand the wide variety that exists within our creative and cultural ecosystem here, especially in the Calgary space. We focus so much on some measurements like jobs. And that's an important thing to focus on, it really is. But it doesn't always reflect all sectors. Or we might focus on unique creative or cultural production. So plays, films, TV shows, uh, dance performances that are created. So let's count those. But that doesn't really account for those in the transversal industry. So using a model like this and layering it with the creative trident model really allows us to ensure that we see all sides of the picture of who our creative and cultural producers are in the Alberta space and the contribution they're making to our wider economy, and so that we can support them and nourish them appropriately.
Great to know. So I'd like to circle back to the creative economy report and the main problem that was kind of highlighted. And so I'll quote it directly. So it says here, despite its significant economic, social, human, and environmental contributions to our region, Calgary's creative economy is underleveraged and overlooked due to a creative ecosystem that is fragmented and inefficient. My question is why is it important for our creative economy to be united in a sense, or to have some form of symbiosis?
Yeah, I don't know if united's the word I'd go for. I would say connected,
Yeah, connected.
absolutely.
Yeah,
Collaborative, which is really important as well. It's important because it leverages individual power and it's exponential in the way that it can encourage growth. Everybody reproducing the wheel over and over doesn't get anybody anywhere. These are sectors with high turnover. These are sectors with high burnout rate. And let's just take the very, very small example of applying for a grant. So much of our cultural production work is grant funded in a myriad of different ways, and the creative community is incredibly entrepreneurial in finding ways to fund important work. But unless they collaborate, everyone's doing it in a vacuum, which means everybody is reproducing the exact same mistakes. By just on that very micro example, bringing two, maybe three organizations into one space in order to have them talk about that process, we can shortcut around all of those problems and gain more funding for all three. So that's just one teeny tiny collaboration example that doesn't even have anything to do with creative output. Now, expand that to when we start bringing together the talents of our film industry with the amazing work being done by our theater industry and connecting that to our cultural, tourism, and heritage groups. That is when we really start to shift the picture of what it means to be a creative province, what it means to have a creative community, especially here in Calgary. But if everyone's working in a silo, then no one's able to really gain that exponential growth. And it's a real shame when that's the case. The thing I'd say though is that's not unique to Calgary. So it takes real dedicated effort and commitment on the part of leadership at a civic level in order to develop those strong ties and in order to ensure equity and access throughout the community to opportunity. And unless we prioritize that, we will remain siloed, work will happen in a vacuum, and it will go unseen, and we will not have the benefits of the work that's being done by the community as a whole.
and also one of the other issues that I've personally noticed in the creative space in Calgary is not only to your point that a lot of creative work does appear to be solid, but a lot of the creative space does seem to be centered in our city center,
Mm.
which kind of leaves out the huge footprint that
Mm.
that is Calgary. And so I'm wondering different ways in which we can bring the creative economy outside of city center. And so would you do you have an idea of different cities or different communities that have been able to incorporate the creative economy across uh, a larger footprint, or in a sense outside of a major metropolitan area?
Yeah, I mean, it's it's done all over. Some of the biggest cities in the world do it in a beautiful, beautiful way. The boroughs of New York being an incredible example in terms of how it
Yeah.
grows. But I think that it's not. I think we're looking at the wrong challenge when we look at that. So when we talk about how the creative economy is only existing downtown, we're only measuring the visible tip of the iceberg. We're not looking at the creative and cultural production that's being done by Calgarians across the city. We're not looking at local, regional, cultural, or ethnic heritage celebrations that are happening. We're not looking at the dance studios that are open across the city, or the music lessons, or the art galleries that are across the city. We're looking at major institutions which tend to be downtown located. And the challenge of bringing Calgarians to the downtown core is one that I am not equipped to deal with. And I do not get to have an opinion on, because that is above my pay grade. And it's a real thing. Bringing Calgarians to a dead downtown is tough. And so addressing that probably goes hand in hand with reprioritizing space in a downtown core to make space for cultural production that's not just major organization driven, that's also individual creative, cultural creator driven work. So that's artist space for studios, and that's touchdown space for design agencies and things like that. But I think focusing on the where kind of hijacks our decision about the support that we need to grow it across Calgary. The venue is probably the least important discussion. It's who is being given access, who is being included, what voices we hear as part of this community, who is being given funding, who is receiving the opportunities, who's on the collaboration stage with everyone else. That is a much more important discussion that has less to do with real estate and more to do with the wide diversity of our Calgary community.
We're almost out of time, but my last question is, what are you most hopeful for regarding Calgary's growth in the creative economy? What is Calgary doing currently that excites you the most?
I think what I'm most excited for, and this is a really selfish thing to be excited for, but I'm most excited to see graduating students from all programs prioritizing their creative work. I am excited to see how, at a personal level, creative expression or participation in creative and cultural events is becoming increasingly important to the generation of Calgarians that's moving here or graduating from universities here or participating in our economy. I love to see that prioritization, but I'm also really excited to see conferences like the Energy Disruptors Conference that's coming in September with a massive focus on creativity. And it's at that point that we start to really leverage the power of our creative economy in all aspects of our provincial space, not just when we keep them in individual locations or celebrate individuals' work, but when we start to weave that tapestry that has creatives in all spaces and all spaces recognizing the power of creativity. That's really exciting to me.